I guarantee you there will not be any post-lunch slump here because we're about to have a fabulous keynote speaker take the stage. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Michael Moody, a co-founder of Insight Education and Insight Advance. Michael began his career as a teacher and also served as a school and district leader. He has touched the lives of tens of thousands of students, teachers, and leaders through his work at Insight in numerous schools and districts across the country and internationally. Michael has become a leader in the national conversation on the impact of race and equity on students' opportunities for high-level outcomes that will enable them to lead their fullest lives. He is passionate about the work and is committed to doing his part to change the current landscape. I know you will find his presentation thought-provoking and persuasive about the need for all of us to embrace this work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Moody.
I love the speaking slot too. In a dark room, right after lunch, your brains are full. Reminds me of teaching middle school math, 5th period. My least favorite period of the day. But we'll get through it together. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to the conference too. This is really important to us. I love the fact that we can convene so many great minds, so many good human beings in one place. I'm excited about the learning you've already had and kind of learning ahead of us. As we start to think about race and the impact of race on schools and our kids, the conversation gets real deep real quick, right? And we need to start thinking kind of really strategically about how do we engage in this work, but also kind of why is it important. So as you know, Insight, we always start with our why. Right? And I want to share with you my why. Many of you in this room already know my why because you've seen the pictures before. But this is how we start to ground our work. This is, what makes it most important. And Simon Sinek, the researcher and author who kind of created these three circles, one of the things he talks about a lot is why do you start with your why? And as he explains it, kind of when we start with our why, we're talking to the part of the brain that's responsible for behavior and decision making. Really important things. He says, people want to know why you do what you do. They don't really care as much about what you do, right? It's the why that engages them in understanding your work. And so I think we all got to start there. We all have to start there kind of in a really personal way. So let me tell you a little bit about me. 2 bullet points. First of all, I'm white. It's out there now, okay, so we're all clear. Good. This is important, and it's only become recently important to me as I learned why it's important to name this. As I started kind of down this journey of understanding race and kind of its impact, growing up as a white kid, this was not front of mind for me, right? In fact, you never had to name the fact that you're white. I don't even know that I thought I was white. I just thought I was some guy kind of cruising through. But that's not the experience of people of color in our country. And it's not the experience of kids of color in our schools. So by starting to unpack that, by naming it first, then we kind of go one more step and figure out kind of what's underneath that and why is that impactful. But it helps you understand kind of why my journey has been so short in this work. But the other thing I like to share is that I'm not an expert. So I'm not a critical race theorist. I don't do research on race and its impact. I'm a middle school teacher. And I've always served students of color, but I never when I was teaching, my biggest regret is I didn't know then what I know now. Because my brain has just developed so much further as I got out of the classroom and started to think about and do this work. But I share that with you because I hope you're not expecting someone to kind of lay all these stats on you from decades of research. All I can share with you is what I know and what I've learned. And hopefully there's something in here that triggers a thought in your brain, kind of gets you to think about something differently than you were before. Helps you start to understand kind of where my missteps were. So I share these missteps and these misconceptions that we're going to dig into, not because they're the right way to think about it or the only way to think about it. It's just the only way I know to think about it. And I'm standing here because I don't know what else to do. I know I want to kind of get into this work. I know it's really passionate for me. You'll see why. But kind of short of start to talk about it, I felt a little bit stuck when I started down this journey. Wasn't sure how to engage. I always talk about my complicated relationship with race. I'm a white guy who's married to a black guy. Thank you. And we have a son who's really cute. Thank you. This is where my nerves go away, and now I can just talk. So this is Zachary. He's 4. Zachary is black and Latino. I am not, right? So as I was starting down this journey of parenthood, one of the things that became really important to me is trying to figure out what does that mean for me? And I was not at all expecting kind of Pandora's box to be open in the way it was, because I can tell you kind of with real clarity, when I didn't have a kid, my thoughts about race were very different than when I had one. Because I was starting to think differently about it, my questions were different. I had to think about how to raise a son in this world, right? And so I had to start leaning. Ben and I hit 20 years on Monday, and thank you. Long time, right? But can you believe that in the first 17 years of that, race was not front of mind for me, despite the fact that I have a partner who's been walking in darker skin than mine for his entire life. And I have a whole side of my family who's also kind of had that experience. So while I think I understood it or kind of started to understand on an intellectual level, it kind of wasn't sinking in too deep because I was having to think about it differently. But as we started to kind of go down here, what I've started to learn is just how naive, kind of how blind, where those blind spots sit, and kind of the work I need to do to make sure that I can be a better human being than I was yesterday. How do I kind of step one day at a time, kind of take this journey along with many of you? I have many friends in the room have been very kind and generous with their time. You know, people are always shocked to see a white guy get on stage when you talk about race. It happened this morning a little bit. And, you know, what is striking to me is how surprising it is, but it's not at all surprising. Because we've relied on people of color to carry this message for far too long. And we've always talked about the shortage of educators of color in our systems, yet we have this very small population of people trying to change systems that were kind of built to hold them down for decades and centuries. So my challenge is this, as we get into this. I'm hoping that we all take up this mantle. That we all realize this is all of our work. Not just specific segments of the population, but all of our work every day. But it needs to start with us personally. This is why we start with the why. What motivates you? Think about your why, because we're going to ask you to think about that. So I want to transition now into the misconceptions I had. And I'm framing the talk with 3 misconceptions, and then kind of how I uncovered the fact that they were actually misconceptions when I thought they were fact in kind of that brain, the 21-year-old new teacher brain, and kind of what the process led to with the hopes of kind of engaging you and thinking about what those might be as well for you. The first one was that education was a great equalizer. The second one was that my race was irrelevant when it came to educating my students. And the third was that being non-racist was the same as being anti-racist. So let's start with the first one. Education is the great equalizer. This quote has stuck with me. If you've been to any NLW or kind of anything Insight did for a lot of years, this quote always sat front and center of our work. Having 3 years of good teachers, those in the 85th percentile, would overcome the achievement deficit between low-income kids, those on free and reduced price lunch, and others. When I was a young teacher, I was hell-bent on being in that 85%. Because that was the frame of reference I had. And in my head, if I could make it there, then my kids were going to be A-okay. And then I had to figure out how to make the teachers around me do that too. Because when I think about, as a coach, for example, getting 3 teachers in a row to be good didn't feel that insurmountable to me, right? If I could get in there and coach those teachers, maybe we could change this. And if we could do that, kind of we could spread that. But it starts to kind of highlight one of the first misconceptions. So let me tell you kind of how the bias creeps in right away. I'm trying to be transparent about what I learned. As I read this, and then I read this, what my mind was doing was saying low income equals students of color. It doesn't say it on the slide, it doesn't say it in the quote, but one of the things I think we've done for a long time and continue to do is we couple race and socioeconomic status so tightly, and then when we get into the conversation about how to change this, it automatically becomes about socioeconomic status because race is too hard to talk about. And race feels too hard to change. And racism feels too deeply embedded. And the structures are already built. And so you can see why I get intimidated by this topic, right? Because and then you start to read and you're like, and this goes back a long time before we were even a country, and it's built into our Constitution, right? So already, you know, kind of as I started to identify with being white, and I started to explore what it means to be kind of racially conscious in education specifically, already kind of my misconceptions, my preconceived notions, my blind spots were starting to surface in ways that I had never thought. I thought I was on the right side of this argument all along because I knew I was going to be in the 85th percentile, and I believe I was. But I don't think I was doing everything I could to make sure that race wasn't impacting my kids. After middle school, I went to third grade. These little kids had such an impact on me. So these are my third graders. I was teaching in Oakland, California. They're adorable too. They're old now, which makes me feel old as well. But it was on this journey that I started to unpack what does that mean for me? I was that teacher. In 2016, right along the birth of Zachary, when I was doing this deep exploration, I just started kind of reading and finding everything I could. And this New York Times data, so Zachary's key change number 1, this slide also changed my life. And here's why. Because it was the first time as an educator, in all the years I had been an educator, that I started to see that if you start to decouple race and socioeconomic status, we are still going to see the same results. And that was surprising to me because we blamed it on poor. How many times have we said poor black and brown kids? There are all kinds of code words, right? I teach in an urban school district. I support poor black and brown students. All of these things, but it's very rare to talk about them in separate cases. But what you're seeing here is data from 10,000 students. They took census data and followed students from birth through adulthood. They took 5,000 black boys and 5,000 white boys, followed them over the trajectory of their life. They all started out high income. I'm going to say that one more time. All 10,000 of these boys started out at the same socioeconomic level, which was the highest one. What he's starting to see is the dots fall. The white boys are the yellow dots, and the blue are the black students. As the data unfolds, we should be alarmed. Because what it's saying is that even though they started in the same place, the black boys were half as likely to stay rich and twice as likely to end up poor. So the white boys, 80% of them stayed middle class or above. That was not true for the black boys in this study. This was surprising to me. It shouldn't have been, but it was. Because for so much of my career, I had been told otherwise. It's because they're poor. It's because they grew up, we talk about zip code, right? All of these things that kind of had been so ingrained that I just wasn't seeing exactly what was going on. The data also changes as we look at kind of different places of the country. So it's a little bit hard to see, but on the right, you'll see grade levels. So the black line in the middle is about average achievement for students. It goes 1, 2, or 3 grade levels above, and 1, 2, or 3 grade levels below. Pink dots, white students. Blue dots, Hispanic. Green dots, black. All the pink, most of the pink above the line, blue and green below the line. If we look at specifically, let's look at Atlanta. See how high that pink dot is? The white students in Atlanta are on average, about 3 grade levels ahead. If you look at the other ones, Hispanic and black students are between 1.1 and 1.5 grade levels below. Same school district, same city. Here's LA. This is where I live. This is where Zachary will be in school. He's in that blue dot and the green dot below. Pink is the white students, all students of color. The size of the dot represents the percentage of student population in that district. So in LA, we have a high percentage of Latinx students. So that's why the blue dot is so big relative to the white dot. Still, it looks the same. New York City. Pink's above, the green and blue are below. Milwaukee. Alarmingly, everybody's below. This gets more attention, right? Because all of a sudden, when the white kids drop below, we're like, oh no, like something's really bad going on in that district. But do you see how kind of the bias sits on us, kind of sits in our brains? It's not until we start to think more critically about it that we realize that even kind of our own predisposition to place judgment on this. And also, the standard bearer is white, right? So we're always comparing in relation to that. First big problem, first big misconception. Even when we control for socioeconomic status, similar economic backgrounds, the gaps persisted. Pink is generally above, blue is generally below. Even if this pink is below, then the blue and green are lower. There's not a data set we can look at in education and not find these gaps. But if we keep coupling them with all these other things and we keep pretending that we're doing the right job, I think we're going to find ourselves in trouble. So the reality is that race plays a bigger role in determining outcomes than education. We know this. If we can account for education, race is still sitting central to the underachievement of our students of color in our schools. And quite frankly, I think to kind of the mess we're in as a country, if I'm being transparent. So when I had my own kid, I was like, but I know better, right? I'm an educator. I know what it takes to make sure Zach's going to be successful in school. We're going to read to him as a kid. He's coming from a 2-parent household. We're not low income. All the things that as a young teacher, I was like, I wish the parents of my students did this, right? Because they didn't do it. Zach loves to read. This is him at the movie theater. We couldn't pull him into the movie because he wanted to read his book. This is him at bedtime. I know, cute. Even Elsa's tired from reading. So my kind of naive brain kept thinking that because I knew what I was doing, and because I carried that privilege, that for somehow, some way, I could protect my son from that. And the reality is this: my privilege is not transferable to him. And already I know that I leveraged that privilege to give him greater footing sometimes, subconsciously and not. But this can't be about my skin color, right? This has to be about me understanding more effectively, and all of us understanding more effectively, how do we engage in the conversation, how do we engage in this work to really make sure that he's not another statistic, that all of our students are not another statistic. There's another reality that comes with this misconception, and the way I would say it is meritocracy is a myth. So meritocracy, right? Pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. Here's a definition. Political system in which economic goods and or political power are vested in individual people on the basis of talent, effort, and achievement rather than wealth or social class. We've all heard it, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work really hard. I remember distinctly hearing it growing up from my grandfather and my father, who both ended up being quite successful despite never going to college. In my head, because of my skin color, what I read that to be was they just worked hard. So if everybody worked harder, they could all have access to the same. It's only kind of in very recent years I started to understand how race likely played a significant dynamic in that progression in my own career and those around me. But when you're blind to that, or you don't even kind of have this conversation, you just go about thinking what you're thinking. Hard work alone is never going to level the playing field. Despite our best attempts, we can't expect our students of color just to work harder, or our teachers of color just to work harder for that promotion. It's not that simple. It would be nice if it was, but it's just not. I think we've oversimplified it by design because it serves our country well. So how do we get out of this line of thinking? Let's move back to the second misconception now. So misconception 2 I had was that my race was irrelevant when it came to educating my students and ultimately my own son. I was not thinking about what it meant to be white as a young teacher. I was thinking about the students I was serving. I went to Harvard. It was the top-rated program at the time. Our entire program was on race. So we showed up in the summer, and we had a 5-week summer intensive. So just to give you a little context, until I got to Harvard, I had had one African-American teacher in my entire life, right? And then I show up to Harvard, and I have Cornel West, Pedro Noguera. I'm sitting in lectures by these folks, kind of the foremost researchers on race, and I realized very quickly how much I didn't know. But even then, kind of in my, I was young, right? Kind of early 20s, it still wasn't that kind of mature. So when I entered teaching, my mindset was very much know your students, which was better than most. So I was like, I'm on top of my game, right? Because they're not paying any attention to the race of their kids, but I am. My library had a lot of diverse authors in it. We had a lot of multicultural, kind of what I called it, multicultural activities in the classroom. We went through the diversity trainings. I really thought I was ahead of the curve, and quite frankly, I was, because I was sitting next to the teachers who said, I don't see color, right? And that made sense to me too, but I felt like, no, I'm more enlightened than that. Like, we're going to really kind of get to these kids, so I need to know their race. So I spent a lot of time kind of just digging in and trying to figure out exactly what that was going to take. But the reality is, my race is critical when it came to educating my students, because what I wasn't seeing is the bias that I brought to the classroom. What I was never unpacking was like, what does it mean to be white in relation to this? What kind of belief systems do you carry into the classroom that you're projecting your students whether or not you think that's true, right? My social construct, my whole way of viewing the world was through my white skin, kind of my experience. And so that was the standard I had. And so I very much felt like I had helped my students of color kind of get there, right? But you can already start to see the flaw in that thinking because getting there was where I was. So that assumed that where I was as the white guy was the standard bearer of where people should be. And our goal was always to get students to that line. I think I did more good for those students than many would have, but I think I could have done a lot more had I been a little more kind of forward thinking and had I had the insights that I've had more recently. The other reality that we're all becoming quite aware of is the fact that teachers of color bring great benefits to the classroom. If my race wasn't important, it also probably wasn't that important for everyone else. If we just focus on good instruction, getting all those teachers to the 85th percentile, things were going to be okay. But as I alluded to, I didn't have teachers of color in my life, didn't understand the value of it, but there's not kind of anything you can do right now without starting to see this. This quote sticks out for me. Black students who had had just one black teacher by third grade were 13% more likely to enroll in college. And those who had two were 32% more likely. That's impactful. Imagine that. What if we get them 3 or 4 or a dozen? Imagine the change we could make if we started to pay attention to this. Now, I say this with the word of caution, because when we see all these headlines, what do we start to do in education? Jump to the quick fix, right? I know the silver bullet, and the silver bullet now is we're just going to hire more teachers of color and all our race problems will be solved. Right? It's not that simple, right? So let's not pretend this is a silver bullet. Our schools are not yet places that acknowledge and account for race. So even when we get more teachers of color into classrooms, where do they go? Right back out in many cases, right? Because we haven't set up systems in school districts to account for that. Not for our students and not for our teachers. So while this is critically important and I think absolutely vital to us kind of moving the needle in this work, what I don't want to do is pretend that this is going to solve the problems. It's much harder than this. We all know it's much deeper than this. So if we sit back and just pretend that by hiring more teachers of color, we're going to kind of see the gains we want, I think we're fooling ourselves. We got to get them in the classrooms, but then we got to make sure our schools support that. And in my opinion, that means everyone at work, everyone needs to be doing this work. Every individual in every school who touches kids need to have critical conversations about race. How do we inspire people to become more critically race conscious? My third misconception was about being non-racist versus anti-racist. I can confidently tell you I've lived a very non-racist life, which in my mind was the good thing, right? Like, I know all these racist people. I am not one of them. Look, I work in an urban school, right? I'm kind of all these things that I think I've been pre-programmed to believe or understand. So I want to do a little definition setting to make sure we're all on the same page. I also believe you cannot have these conversations without being clear about what we're saying. So we can talk around these words, but we very rarely say words like white supremacy, racism, particularly in contexts like schools, because it feels too scary and it feels a little dangerous. But racism is the belief that the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Ibram Kendi, one of the, I think, kind of foremost right now scholars around critical race theory, his book is How to Be Anti-Racist, but he also has another book called Stand from the Beginning. If you want to get deep into the historical context of this, read that. It's completely overwhelming, but really good. He said the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify it and describe it, then dismantle it. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive term into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. So because I'm a middle school teacher, and because you all been sitting for a few minutes, here's what I need you to do. Talk to a partner. What is this quote saying? Why do I have this quote up? What does it mean to you? Unpack this quote with somebody at your table, and try to figure out what he means when he's saying what he said. What I would love to do is get audience comments, but we're a little too big for that today, and I can't see anyone anyways, but it's probably a good thing, right? But what I'm hoping you're starting to see is kind of there's so much nuance in this conversation. It's not until we start to unpack the nuance that we see what's really going on. Let's say that one more time. There's so much nuance in this conversation. It's not until we unpack the nuance that we're going to get to the truth. We're living in a system that's rigged. It's designed to hold people down. We have to take that seriously. For Zachary, for your kids in your schools, for people sitting at this table. If we don't, it's going to be a long road. Kind of as long a road as we've already traveled because we haven't made as much progress as we think we've made. To define non-racism and anti-racism, to give you some context now, so non-racism is defined as the passive rejection, opposition, and disassociation from behaviors, discourses, and ideologies that are considered racist. This was me for a lot of years. That's not me. I don't like that. They shouldn't be saying that. They're wrong. But I still sat in my comfortable white space, kind of exerting my white privilege, which allowed me to sit out of the conversation and just judge people from the outside rather than setting my foot into the conversation and trying to make a difference. It's easy to see what non-racist is only when we start to define anti-racism, which is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, attitudes, so that the power is the key word. The power is just redistributed and shared equitably. This is a power play, right? We've known it all along. It is. But we have to name it. And it's uncomfortable to name. I get it. I've sat in the discomfort. I'm uncomfortable right now. I'm always thinking about, like, am I saying the right thing? And that's very white to do, right? But kind of, yeah, see? It's the people of color who are like, yes. You're right, and you were doing that. But luckily, I've had people like Ben and others. Ben is here, by the way. I've never talked when Ben was in the room, so it's kind of like throwing me off my game a little bit. But it honestly has been through relationships and my own deep exploration that I started to understand kind of where my missteps were, why this misconception was my misconception. Let's look at it on a continuum. So if we talk about what it means to be non-racism or non-racist, someone who sits in that side of the kind of continuum, you endorse a racial hierarchy, which means we allow it to persist. We acknowledge that it's there. We may not feel like we're participating in it, but we're actually we are by not. It assumes a belief that the problems are rooted in groups of people. I'm not racist, but those people are. That part of the country is. That, all these things. So it's never me, it's outward, and so it's very easy to say, it's not me, I don't have anything to do. Like, they need to fix themselves because I don't have those beliefs. And finally, it allows inequities to persevere. It makes sense, right? If we're not doing anything, if I'm not doing anything about it, then they're going to kind of keep going the way they're going. When we get to the anti-racism side of things, the first thing we do is endorse racial equality. You have to believe, this is why the why is important. If you go back to that very first slide, this is why the why is important. Because you got to believe it. If you don't believe it, forget it. You're never going to get anywhere. But so what is it going to take to get you that belief? Find that why. And endorses the fact that we can be equal and are equal. It locates the roots of the problem in power and policies. So you can see a shift, right? Because instead of now saying externally it's those people, if we acknowledge kind of where the power lies and the problem lie, then maybe we can do something different about it. Because now it's not external. When I was CAO in Washington, D.C., I had power and policies in place, right? Was I doing anything to change what was going on? And finally, it confronts racial inequities. This is really important and the hardest part of this whole chart. I can't sit by and allow it to exist. I have to step into it, right? I have to kind of acknowledge it. I have to own it, but then I have to address it for myself first. And I believe we should all start with ourselves because it's through that exploration that these misconceptions start to happen. I'm going to use one more quote from Kendi. I didn't put the whole quote on here. It's very long. But I want you to read this, and then I'm going to tell you what else he says. So he talks about kind of when racist calls a racist. They deny it. They refuse to talk about it. They shut down the conversation. Feeling offended, if they were personally attacked. If someone had ever called me racist, I would have immediately stepped into my defensive stance. I'm not racist. My husband's black, right? Kind of all these things, right? My best friend, okay? All these things that we hear put us in defensive posture. When you're sitting there, you're not learning, right? We're just defending. There's no growth happening when this label's attached. But Kendi's assertion is that maybe we should start using the terms for what they were intended to do, which is describe what is happening. Getting back to our early quote, if racist, or the term racist, continues to be felt as a judgment versus a description, the whole tenor of the conversation changes. What this quote goes on to say is that an anti-racist, when they're called a racist, they stop and reflect. They ask why they were perceived to be racist. They work to change whatever behavior they presented that was racist. And then they try to do better the next day, is what he says in a nutshell. He says it way more eloquently than I did. But that's what he says in a nutshell. Like, how are we processing what we're doing? So he's very overt, and I've learned to become very overt in the terms we use too, because I think if we can put the uncomfortable terms on the table and grapple with them, then at least we can name what's going on, and then we move through that. If we're going to sit in this defensive posture of all these terms, we're just going to kind of circle our, kind of keep going in circles, not knowing where we're headed. The reality is that ensuring equitable outcomes for the students we serve is going to require all of us to take action. It's going to require all of us to think differently, unpack our own stuff, figure out what's going on in your head, examine what it means to be the color that you are, from the background that you come from, how you were raised, all of these things that contribute to us being adults and sometimes ineffective at addressing the problems of race. And this is my all-time favorite quote. We know how to be racist, and we know how to pretend not to be racist. Now let's know how to be anti-racist. The middle sentence is particularly true. We know how to pretend not to be racist, because that term carries with it such judgment and such tighten our shoulders, sit back in our seats, that we just dismiss it right away. So what? What does this matter? Why does it matter? I'm going to show a 5-minute video because in all the learning that I've done, this video in 5 minutes presented a picture to me that I had not seen in a very coherent way. So let's go ahead and start the video, please.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So I have a question. It's a good video. Yes, I encourage you to watch it, share it. Is this okay? Is it okay that white families have $100 of wealth compared to the $5.04 that are held by black families? Is it okay that my family had access to home loans, college, when other families not far, I grew up just outside of LA, so it's not as if I was not growing up in a diverse area, did not. Our schools have changed, right? But our country has not. In 2014, it's been called the majority minority, but I think there's some irony in the title, right? Because you're not a minority if you're in the majority. So we should probably just stop using the minority term. And Sharon Contreras, Superintendent Guilford, this is one thing she says all the time. Like, we're done using the term minority, okay? It's diminutive. We don't need to be talked about. We're human beings. We're people. Let's kind of name it what it is. But you can see kind of as our schools and public schools start to even become more diverse, we got to have this conversation. We can't just keep sitting by hoping, being non-racist, right? Hoping it solves itself. So what should we do? Our collective call to action. First of all, I ask you to know your why. Why is this work going to be important to you? Why is it already important to you? If it's not, why should it be? Find that why. If you're not, use Zachary. Take my why. He's worth it. Equip yourself to engage and be ready for discomfort. And what I mean by that is this. Kind of my first step into this kind of self-discovery was not to go ask all my friends of color what I should know. My first step was start reading. Because then I started to understand what I didn't know. And then I went to some very close friends and I was like, I don't know what to do about this. I don't know how to process this. And the advice I got over and over and over, they were all kind of people of color in my life. They all said, just start doing it. Just start having the conversation. You just got to get into it. Like, it's going to be messy and it's going to be uncomfortable and you're going to say some dumb stuff. Okay? But say it. Because then we can help you correct it and then you don't have to say it again. Right? But it wasn't until I got the kind of courage, thanks to a very good support network, to step into the conversation that I was just going to sit by being non-racist. Finally, examine your own misconceptions. I share mine in the hopes that it's going to trigger some of yours. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, we all carry some misconceptions about race. So examine those. Find them. What biases do you carry into the classroom, into your school, into your role as a superintendent, whatever it may be, kind of what's there and how do you unpack it? And finally, we got to practice being anti-racist. Start small, work big. This was hard for me. The other stuff was a little bit easier because it was all stuff I could do on my own. This was hard to me. One of the things, so I made a list of all the anti-racist things I had to do that were going to be hard, and one of them was talking to my family and just pushing them a little bit, saying, you know what, this is what I feel like, and I'm learning, and, members of our family now are black, so what are we going to do about this? It wasn't easy, but it happened, right? And so that first step, but we got to think about what's your next step. We took all of your organizations, We added up the number of students you support today, and if everyone in this room could make an impact, 2.5 million students are sitting in schools today that are supported by you. 2.5 million students are supported by people in this room. Imagine the impact we could have. These are the data that we need to start to look at to feel like we can do this. Because I'll tell you, if you don't go here, it feels overwhelming. All the reading I did, I was like, forget it. There's nothing I could do about this, right? How am I going to undo 2 decades and a whole country's history and existence? I can't do that. But if we start to look at the other side of the coin, one person at a time, one individual at a time, starting with ourselves, I think we can make that impact. So where are you? Where are you today? Where are you in your journey? Where are you in your kind of race consciousness? As an educator, as a human being? Where's your organization? Start with yourself and then move there. At Insight, we've been doing this work for about 2.5 years already. And we're just now starting to figure out, like, how does our conversation now impact our work? We very deliberately started with the individuals on our team doing the work of unpacking their own stuff. Mostly because we automatically jump to the systems and we forget that we need to kind of undo our own stuff before we do that. But what I'm seeing is it's changed the entire culture of our organization, and it's also changing the way people are talking to our clients, talking to you, because all of a sudden their kind of mindset is just different. And what are you going to do next? What's the most immediate next step you can put on your plate to make sure that this work continues? I'm begging you to do something. If you're white, I'm really begging you to do something, because I don't want you to do what I did for 17 years and pretend this isn't a problem, or not acknowledge that's a problem, or think you're doing all the right work and realize you're not. We owe it to our kids to do better. And they're not jaded yet, right? My little 3rd graders were amazing. I loved them, and they loved me. We had such a good relationship, but imagine the impact I could have had if I had just a bit of a different mindset, even greater. We cannot leave our kids languishing in this. It's not enough for one more generation to feel like you do. Sorry, I'm getting mad. I just can't let go of how important this feels. For the first time in my career, I've been really uncomfortable, but I'm so energized by this work because it just feels like the right work finally. I can train all day on how to write a good assessment. I really can. I feel expert at instructional design. I feel like not at all expert in this topic, but it's also kind of the first time that I'm like, this might matter. More than anything else I've done, this conversation matters. It matters to me. It matters to my son. It matters to my husband. It matters to all these people who in my life have not heard that. So I'm begging you to do something. I'm begging you to think differently about the work. I'm pleading with you and asking you and hopefully encouraging you to think about what's your role in this. We can do this. We have to believe that. We have to believe 2 things. We got to believe it matters, and we got to believe it's possible. If we don't think it matters, we should just stop right here. And if we think it matters, I was in the it matters but it's impossible for a little while because it felt too big. So if I felt like it mattered, but I wasn't sure what to do, so I was kind of paralyzed in that space of like, I know it matters, but I'm not sure we could do anything about it. The only thing that's helped me is to kind of pare it down to like, first, Moody, start with yourself. Okay? Get your head right. Understand this. Be a good listener. Be a good listener. Stop talking, right? Hear what people are saying. Acknowledge that. Accept it. Don't deny it. Don't tell people their experiences are wrong. My job right now is to hear what people say and just own it and acknowledge it for what it is, put it on the table and say, okay, what do we do about that? We got to believe that we can change the world one person at a time. And it's your turn. It's our turn. Collectively, I do believe we can do this, but we're not going to do it alone. We got to start with ourselves and then kind of move to, I start with myself, I move to my family, kind of move to my organization. Now we're moving to more organizations. But I'm just one guy and you're just one person too. So could we all just step into this in a way that's going to have impact for the kids? They deserve it. We cannot let them down for any longer. And I really hope that you'll just jump into this journey with us. As you can see, we're not afraid to get into it, and it's going to be messy, but it's the right work. It's the work we all need to be doing. So I'm going to thank you in advance for changing the world, because I know you're going to do it. So thank you for being here. I hope you have a good rest of the conference.